Good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? All right, welcome to our panel today. How many of you have a threat intelligence capability at your organization? Nice. Oh. All right, we're going to nerd out today. How many of you actually have intelligence vendors? All right, good. Glad to see that. Well, today, hopefully, we're going to help you figure out how to get some return on investment of your intelligence vendors. So good day, everyone. My name is Lisa Ackerman, and I am going to be having the privilege here today of being your moderator. Hopefully, we'll be able to get this return on investment of our intelligence vendors. That's our goal here today. I've spent most of my career in the intelligence community in some fashion, and today I'm hoping to spark some good conversation with some current vendors and help us talk about the value of threat intelligence, how we can use it to protect our networks, our employees, and our brand, both offensively, not in the hackback way, all right, and defensively. So in this panel, we'll define CTI just to make sure that we level set there, discuss how organizations can benefit from its use, and then get into some use cases to help our audience better understand why they should have this capability within their organization if they don't already. So today, we thought we'd have some fun. Instead of just being, four suits up here, we thought we'd add a little flair to it. We have introduced some characters. So we have Drax, or Levi Gundert from Recorded Future. We have Silver Surfer, or Tom Hoffman from Flashpoint. We have Janae Hom, who's serving as the WASP here today, and I'm Black Widow. And so today we are going to talk to you guys about getting our ROI out of intelligence, and let's get to it. So to begin, it may be good to level set what CTI is. So on the left side of the screen there, you can see that the panelists have their version of what cyber threat intelligence is. So I get this question often, and I love to nerd out with folks who don't understand the value of intelligence. I get the question often, and I used to laugh at it until I really started understanding people just don't really get it if they haven't done it before. So on the left side of the screen, you can see our panelist version, and then we added, for some flair, we added ChatGPT's version. I mean, after all, who's not talking about AI these days, right? We're all trying to figure out how to use it in intelligence ourselves. So as you can see, the panelist version describes the potential for intelligence to help organizations in making informed decisions, and also to enable them to implement appropriate measures to protect their digital assets and their networks. The ChatGPT version, however, they talk about tactics, techniques, procedures, TTPs, or indicators of compromise, IOCs. While they both differ, offer different viewpoints to some extent, they're the same in that when it comes to the analysis piece, which is really the bread and butter of what intelligence analysis is. So I'll caveat, to us, CTI is not just about processing IOCs or TTPs. It's really about marrying the analysis to your organization and making sure that you understand the actual threats. All right, so we've defined CTI, and we've introduced our panelists, so let's get to know them a little bit better. So intelligence functions have historically belonged in the government space, as you guys know. But in the last 10 years or so, it's really moved to the private sector. As such, there are many types of intelligence vendors. So let's take a few minutes to talk to our panelists today and understand what differentiates them from other intelligence vendors. Tom, can you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us all here today. At Flashpoint, we really start with understanding our customer collection requirements, and then from there, we align different collection capabilities where we can really index different parts of the internet and bring those into a system, a safe system where our customers can interact with that data, and they use that for a lot of different business functions, from cyber threat intelligence all the way to brand protection, executive protection. So for us, it's really about understanding customers, what they need, what their interests are, and then aligning our intelligence capabilities to support them.
Levi?
Yeah, I think there's such a breadth of information and organizations understand in an intelligence program that they need different pieces of that information to do the analysis, and sometimes that's automated analysis, sometimes it's human analysis, but when you think about where that data comes from, endpoint telemetry, midpoint telemetry, malware metadata, quote unquote, dark web sources, criminal forums, criminal marketplaces, open sources, mobile messaging apps like Telegram, Discord, et cetera. And we've seen recently, obviously, with some of the recent revelations in the intelligence community, and information being disclosed that it happens on those types of platforms. So having broad-based visibility is really important, both from a collection standpoint, but also an analysis standpoint.
Janae?
Yeah, I would say that one key differentiator is that we are analyst-led. So we collect and analyze information from a variety of sources and feeds, and we package that up into a finished intelligence product for our clients. Our analysts come from a wide range of backgrounds across both the public and private sector, which provides breadth and diversity. And as a managed intelligence service, we understand that every client is unique. And many of our clients, they really see us as an extension of their team versus simply as a vendor, and that the same team of analysts support a client for an extended period of time, and as such, they become experts on the client's priorities and challenges.
That is great. Now, all organizations don't have intelligence capabilities, and we demonstrated that here today. So why do you think that they outsource this capability if they do have it or don't have it?
So in addition to the associated overhead costs with recruiting, onboarding, training, benefits, and tools, I think it's extremely valuable to have an external perspective. So whether you are identifying and analyzing vulnerabilities in public-facing infrastructure or measuring online sentiment as it pertains to brand protection, that external perspective is key, and that's really the same view that your adversaries are going to have. Additionally, in the event of an emergency, it's going to be a lot more expedient to bring in a vendor who has subject matter expertise in whatever that incident is. And then finally, a lot of organizations, they have restrictions, legal limitations as to what kind of data they can search for and analyze on their own systems and platforms, as well as restrictions as to where they can investigate outside the firewall, such as criminal marketplaces and forums. So I think in those cases, it's really helpful to bring in a vendor.
Tom, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Janae covered it really well. It really is a decision where you need to understand your business and their risk appetite, because some organizations, they have very large teams, they have a lot of capabilities, but operating within like a criminal network might not be something, if you're a large multinational corporation, that you really want to take on that risk, because the blowback of doing something wrong in some of these environments could bring a lot of brand damage. It could potentially make the organization a larger target. So really just understanding really your organization and what their risk appetite is with dealing with some of these activities is another good way of really about determining when you want to bring in an outside vendor.
That's great. As a parent in the news, there's a lot of cyber threats out there. There's intelligence vendors who report on it. There's also a lot of open source news feeds that provide information to us constantly. I mean, we're barraged by different threats daily. And from your perspective, Levi, what do you think some of the greatest threats are that we're looking at?
Yeah, I think if you had asked that question a couple years ago, most organizations would say they were very concerned about ransomware. And I think in the last couple years, organizations have been able to put both detection, prevention, and response capabilities in place to deal with ransomware. Everything from the policy side with insurance to making sure that backups are able to restore systems and sort of everything in between. And I think today, where we're seeing organizations sort of irrespective of vertical that they sit in, they're very focused on third-party risk. They're very focused on supply chain risk. They're also focused on identity and access management. And even though as a security industry, we've been talking about identity access management for 20 plus years, I think there's so much malware in the space now, different families like Redline and Vidar that are very focused on stealing credentials, cookies, and making that available to different criminal buyers. I think those are the two areas that we see organizations operationally very focused on, which is how are we going to operationally respond on third party, whether that's our tier one vendor suppliers or even some of the supply chain risk in the code that we produce the packages, the libraries that go into the code that we produce. And those are very complex questions, I think, for enterprises in general, where there's no silver bullet answers. It's very much, how are we going to approach this in the same way that we sort of approached ransomware to put more effective controls and mitigations in place in those topical areas.
Great. Tom, anything for you to add from the deep and dark web perspective?
Yeah, as Levi mentioned, ransomware is absolutely getting better, but it's still a big problem that we're seeing, especially with the small and medium-sized businesses who don't have the teams in place, who don't have the budgets, who don't really understand what it takes to defend against this. So in a good way, all the attention, and I know there's a lot of talks here at the conference about how to deal with ransomware and appropriately respond. So I think the attention is there, but it's also now just pushing that downstream a little bit, and now we're seeing that it's still impacting a lot of businesses, just not necessarily getting all the headlines quite as often. So something that, in addition to everything Levi said, still those threats that we've been dealing with for years are still going to be in our sides for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. So we've all heard the saying that it takes a village to raise a family. In my opinion, it takes all of us to defend against the threat actors. And that means that we have to share information. Sharing information is critical, I think, to the work that we do in intelligence. From a user perspective, we do that, but from a vendor perspective, how important is it that vendors actually share intelligence information to make sure that you guys are helping the customers defend against these kind of threats? Tom, can I start with you?
Yeah, it's an interesting area because I think this is where the mission really unites us more than it divides us. We're all in cybersecurity to help protect organizations, protect people, and I think at the end of the day, we know that no one organization has all of the pieces of the puzzle, and it really does take everyone coming together, and there's a lot of great trust groups. When we see major attacks that are really impacting the entire internet infrastructure like WannaCry, like this is where you see there's actually a lot of sharing that goes on. And our customers also expect it as well. So they are sharing as well with a lot of the ISACs and the ISALs. So this is something where I think while it is still a competitive business, there is actually a lot of sharing, especially when it comes to some of those really big threats that could potentially have a major impact across the entire internet, and that's something I think is really reassuring.
Great, thank you. Janae, anything to add from your perspective?
I think Tom covered it really well. Definitely where our capabilities complement each other in solving really difficult problems. That's the key time to share information. And I would say research is another big area where we collaborate. I mean, you'll see it at conferences here where, competitors are working together to solve very difficult problems. I mean, that could be anything from, research on ransomware, but also, combating human trafficking as well.
Very good. So being able to share information is really good, but when can't you share information?
It's typically when it's client data or information about an incident with a particular client. That's really where it's no-go. There are times where victims will proactively share, or you can ask for information to share, but it's typically when it comes to client data, that's one where our hands are really tied in a good way from preventing from sharing.
Good, great, thank you. So as an intelligence professional, I've been surprised by a lot of things over my career, and one of them is, how much reading that we have to do. I mean, the biggest thing we have to do is read every day, right? We have to understand what's going on. We also have to understand our organization and make sure we're collecting the right things for them. As an intelligence vendor, Janae, what's some things that have surprised you as a vendor in this space?
So I've always loved reading and history, but I was also surprised by the sheer amount required in this industry. I think another thing is just how quickly you become extremely knowledgeable in areas that you maybe had little to no exposure to in the past. So my first solely OSINT investigation was translating Korean cybersecurity blogs and archived malware documents. And I really felt like I was translating two languages because, I would start with translating the Korean into English, and then I would have to figure out exactly what they were saying, having very little background in that area at the time. I'd say another thing that continues to surprise me in honestly a good way is just the varying degrees of maturity in cybersecurity programs. For example, we have clients who they have very mature programs. They know exactly what their vulnerabilities are. They know where we fit in and how we can best help them. And on the other hand, we have clients who they're just standing up their programs, and what they're really looking for is a partner to, not only help them identify where they're vulnerable, but also to prioritize in how they can mitigate those risks. And I think with the latter, it's very easy to get caught up in a circle of questions of, well, how can you help me and what do you need help with? Which isn't always as productive as asking the right question, which is cliche as it might sound. Asking somebody what cybersecurity issues are keeping them up at night or at the forefront of their thoughts, that's probably going to get the ball rolling a lot faster and really result in more actionable intelligence.
Great, thank you. Levi, anything to add?
Yeah, I think one of the things as a vendor is sometimes you have partners and customers that expect that you see everything all the time, everywhere. And the fact of the matter is that nobody sees everything. It might be blasphemy to say it, but even the NSA doesn't see everything, right? So I think there are sometimes misaligned expectations just in terms of there is broad sourcing and collection, but we don't see everything, and that's just the nature of the massive amount of information that we're all trying to process every day.
Yeah, it is funny how we're often expected to know everything, aren't we? Or at least a little bit about everything. So I believe one of the greatest benefits of intelligence is allowing our leadership to have decision advantage. Making sure that they have the right information at the right time to help inform decision making to them, I think is really a lost benefit that people really haven't taken advantage of yet. So how is it that our leaders can actually take advantage of intelligence to use to help them in making better and more informed business decisions?
Yeah, this is obviously a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and you and I have talked a lot about this. So intelligence sort of functions in two different capacities. On the one hand, intelligence is very much its own security control. So when you apply it into an automated workflow for vulnerability management or security operations or third-party risk or red teaming, pen testing, there's so much goodness that comes out of it in an automated fashion operationally, and now it's its own security control. But when you sort of up-level the conversation to the board of directors and the executive layer, they don't really care about that. It's not that they don't care, it's cool, right? But on another level, that's not their world. Their world is risk, right? And when you talk about an enterprise, they may not fully understand security, they may not fully understand technology, but they understand the language of risk. And you and I were talking about this earlier, that the SEC is prompting organizations in financial services especially to add cyber experience to the board, and this may change the dynamic a little bit. But at the end of the day, if you're an intelligence professional, you have to figure out how you're going to bridge into the language of risk, into the world of risk, where executives and the board are going to care about it. And if you think about how this happens, generally speaking, you have enterprise risk management teams, you have GRC teams, governance, risk, and compliance teams, and they are calculating risk for everything: financial risk, economic risk, geopolitical risk, all the things that potentially impact a business and an enterprise, and cyber is one piece of that. So if you talk to a typical CISO, they'll tell you they're responsible for maybe 5 or 6 subsections of a very large sort of risk portfolio. And how that gets presented to a board, as we all know, is likelihood of occurrence and impact, or what I like to say is proximity and impact, right, on some sort of heat map: high, medium, low, red, yellow, green. And I'm not a huge fan of the medium and yellows, because what are you supposed to do with that, right? I'm much more a fan of it's either red and we're going to address it, or it's green and we don't need to address it. But it's interesting when you look at the board level, when do those data points on the graph actually move? It tends to only be when there's something big happening in a geopolitical way. So for example, Russia invades Ukraine. There are significant cyber implications to that physical world event. So when you talk to CISOs at what actually will move a data point at a board level and something they care about on a risk side, it's really the convergence of physical geopolitical events and cyber events. That's really what they want to hear about. And we all know this paradigm, and you all know this in the room as intelligence practitioners. There's somebody reading the Wall Street Journal or listening to something on the way into work, and they're fired up about it by the time they get into work, and they want the intelligence team to tell them, how does this impact us? Are we vulnerable, right? And so to your question, getting out ahead of this proactively means you're understanding what's happening in the physical geopolitical world, and you're able to extrapolate out with second order implications what that means in the cyber domain, in the cyber realm for your organization. And it's not necessarily simple to do, but that's really what executives want when they think about where are we going to allocate security resources and how are we going to properly time the investment of those security resources. And that's really what they need in terms of strategic intelligence for decision advantage. And I don't think it's easy. I was actually talking to CISO last week in Norway, and they were saying they just kicked out 15 diplomats, Russian diplomats from Norway. They just expelled them out of the country. So if you're an energy operator or you're another large enterprise in Norway, what is the cyber implication of that? And what are you expecting to see out of Russia because Norway just expelled 15 Russian diplomats, right? That's one example. So that is what constantly needs to be happening inside of an intelligence team, outside of the operational piece.
Yeah, and it's more than just reporting on the news, right? You know, they can read the news. It's up to us to give them that analyst piece. Why is it so important? Give them the so what factor. Why am I reporting this to you? And maybe it'll help them make better decisions. M&A is another very good reason to use intelligence, right? If you're going out and you're doing your due diligence to acquire a new organization, well, what can the intelligence team find and provide to the leadership in the deep and dark web or in other forums that we follow and track that we can contribute to that decision. So there's really a lot of areas we can support from that perspective.
Yeah, the so what, now what is so important to think through at the executive tier. Like we as practitioners think it's super interesting when there's a new phishing campaign, there's a new type of malware. You know, we think it's very relevant and interesting, but you have to up-level your thinking to what is the so what, now what for someone who has the big picture.
Yep, absolutely. Couldn't have said that better. Thank you. So now that we better understand CTI and our panelists, let's dig into a few use cases. Today we're going to talk about brand protection, spear phishing, and threat landscapes. Now we could sit up here and talk all day long about different kinds of use cases. We thought we'd pick some high-level ones and dive into them a little bit. So for our first use case, I'll ask Tom to talk to us about how we can use intelligence to protect our brand. Now, brand protection is the process taken by companies to safeguard its reputation, people, intellectual property from infringement, counterfeiting, and other malign purposes. So what does this have to do with intelligence? Hopefully we're answering that today. There are many different use cases around brand protection that requires organizations to act both from a proactive perspective as well as defensively for reacting. One of them that we want to talk about today is social media and specifically Telegram. So as most of you know, Telegram is increasingly being used by threat actors to conduct illicit activities because it offers a secure anonymous platform to spread information, scam unsuspecting users, operate largely outside the purview of law enforcement. In this use case, we'll use an example of a threat actor who's set up a Telegram channel to mimic a large manufacturing organization. And their purpose is to try and deceive customers to drive them to that channel for fraudulent purposes. Taking down these channels, as you know, can be like whack-a-mole. So how do customers of yours actually what steps do they take to recognize this threat, and how can they, defend against it?
Yeah, Telegram, we have been saying it's the glue nowadays that's really tying together all sorts of different malicious activities. We have seen, as you highlighted, it's very difficult to take down. The ability to create accounts on the platform is very easy, and it is increasingly being used worldwide. So we're seeing these types of activities pop up every single day. And it's a perfect use case for where you want an intel vendor to really be your eyes and ears outside of your network. When you're first tipped off to these types of activities, sometimes it comes in through your abuse mailbox, or maybe it's a tweet that goes into your company. oftentimes that's the first time you know something is happening outside of my network that I need to better understand. And that's exactly where you should engage your intel vendors. They can quite often give you other options that you just haven't thought about when you're trying to deal with this. In this case, if it's abusing the brand, you can attempt to initiate that takedown. The vendors can support that. I think anyone who's tried to take down something from Telegram, it's not a surefire thing that's going to work. So then you have to start thinking through, what else do I need to do to mitigate this activity? And this is where you can, first of all, set up monitoring. So a lot of the vendors can keep the eyes on what's happening in this channel. They can understand what's the nature of the activity. Are they trying to drive traffic? Are they conducting some phishing campaign? Are they trying to drive you to another site where they might drop some malware? So these are all things that are at play. And then you have to also start thinking about internally, what do I need to respond as an organization to this threat? Is it impacting our customers? Do we need to get the PR folks engaged so they can get some messaging out to your customers to let them know that you're on top of this, or warn them of the threat? How do you get updates into your internal customers if they're being targeted? So these are all things that, as an incident's unfolding, it moves very quickly, and that's one where when you think about an intel vendor, they can give you those extra options and that extra breathing room so you can make those smarter decisions. And that's one where we've seen that you're also allowed to engage engage the actors. So this is where, when you're talking about going offensive, like, this is the nature. It's not hacking back, but you can engage the threat actors, the groups. You can ask for more information. You can solicit to see what else is going on, just so you can enrich really your understanding of what's happening within that channel.
Do you recommend organizations setting up their own official channels on all these social media platforms so they know what's real and what's not?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one where it's knowing your business and where your business operates, and make sure that you have accounts on any of the platforms where you're conducting business. Absolutely, it helps cement that relationship even with the platform, but then also understand where your customers, or I'm sorry, where your employees are going. So if your employees are all on a platform like Discord, you might have never even thought about having to collect on that type of activity if you're a large manufacturer. But if your employees are on there, then maybe it's an area where, again, if they're being targeted, you need to also think about expanding that umbrella as well.
Right. What role does typo squatting play in enabling these kind of threats?
Yeah, kind of like we were talking about earlier, these age-old problems that never seem to go away. It's all about tricking the end user. So typo squatting is still very active, and when we talk about that glue, sometimes it's redirecting to sites, it's using those Telegram channels, it's using different ways in which all of us, when we're on our phones, when you're glancing very quickly, like, they're very ingenious with the ways in which they can set up these different spoof sites, and typo squatting still continues to be a big problem.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm not sure what the solution is to that problem, because we have to start thinking more like the actors in order to defend against them, I think. Levi, by now everybody knows that phishing is consistently one of the top threats organizations face. Regardless of the sector. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to have phishing, and we're all doing different things to defend against that. And the reason why it's so successful is because actors are still having success at it, right? If it works, don't break it. For this use case, we're going to talk about spear phishing now. And spear phishing is more direct and targeted at businesses or individuals. So if we have a threat actor who sends a carefully crafted email to someone in an organization, maybe they're in accounting, and it's a known vendor that the invoice is coming in, the data is very legitimate, looks like a real invoice, but it's not. The email has very specific details that the accountant would actually expect to see. How does an organization, like say a medium-sized organization, and they might not have great capabilities like a larger organization does, how do they work against this kind of threat? How do they protect themselves? What kind of actions can they take?
Yeah, I think the controls around email in general are pretty good, but of course the problem is bigger in terms of social engineering. And what a lot of our clients are experiencing is deepfake attacks that involve voice, right? So the CEO calls a subsidiary in accounts payable and says, hey, this is really urgent, we need to pay this vendor. And especially when you have a foreign subsidiary, those attacks, they're highly likely to succeed. They're very effective. So the deep fake that technology is only going to get better. And you can imagine in 5 years, if we're sitting in a Zoom call, sort of wondering when the CEO says, you're going to get into crypto, whether it's actually the CEO in that Zoom call or just a deep fake, right? And there's a lot of challenges that come with that. And I think there's a lot of good technology emerging on detecting deep fakes. But now, of course, we have generative AI, and we can expect that those phishing emails will no longer have grammatical mistakes the way they historically have. And a lot of the guidance that we've given to employees over the years about, look for grammatical errors, look for sentence structure that doesn't really make sense. Generative AI and tools like ChatGPT are completely removing those types of barriers from social engineering. So when you combine that with deep fakes and then even business email compromise kind of 3.0, which is actors gaining access to resources like Google Docs and then sending a comment from the doc to an employee, which makes it even more legitimate. There's so many different angles that actors are looking to social engineer employees. So I think we need to look at how we're doing training and probably redesign it in a more holistic way that addresses both how they do computing at home and personal, but also how that will carry over and impact the professional world. Because there's no simple answer to social engineering, and employees have to understand the dynamics and sort of what they're up against there.
Absolutely. I was at Microsoft pre-day yesterday, and they said it only takes 3 seconds of voice to be able to then create a deep fake. How is it that organizations can start thinking about using, or how actors are using AI? I mean, it's going to be a speed race, right? How are we going to be able to defend against that?
Yeah, and that's the thing about generative AI is if it's only the adversaries using it, it becomes an asymmetric problem. And the biggest issue here is speed. I don't think any of us as defenders are necessarily prepared for the onslaught in terms of just the increase in velocity that we're probably going to see out of attackers, especially in the area of social engineering. So obviously there's a lot of concerns right now over privacy, over how security teams are using generative AI, but organizations have to figure out a way to harness the capability, because if it's just the adversaries, again, speed is really going to become an issue really quickly here.
Are we in the arms race again?
It certainly feels that way.
Sure does. All right, thank you. Janae, to better understand your organization, I recommend getting a threat landscape. I think it really is very telling about what an actor can see about your organization. As you know, a threat landscape is a comprehensive baseline of an organization's threat profile that can aid them in better understanding themselves and the threats against them. If an organization is developing a new intelligence capability, or say they want to open up business in a new location that might be a high-risk jurisdiction, how would they go about getting a threat landscape accomplished, and then what's the benefit of doing that?
Sure. So with any threat landscape assessment, specifically one that, if you're going to start operating in a high-risk nation, I would definitely start with looking at the risk indicators that are specific to that region, such as physical and digital attacks, intellectual property theft, and criminal activity, as well as how these risks can impact your existing infrastructure. Are these actions being taken by the host nation or by a neighboring nation? What influence or impact do the local authorities have on these actions? Are they complicit? I would also look at, have there been any disinformation campaigns against your industry, or are there any ideological opposition groups? And is that behavior coordinated, or is it random and opportunistic? And when we look at online sentiment, the worst cases are when negative sentiment can escalate to an actual physical attack or a digital attack. So in the past, we had an organization who came to us after suffering some arson attacks and kidnapping of their personnel. And they requested a threat landscape assessment. So we were able to identify really how negative sentiment that was initially directed toward the government shifted toward the client, as well as looking at who the local influencers were, patterns of behavior, escalation tactics that ultimately garnered support from the local population for those attacks. On the other hand, we were able to identify what actions that organization had taken in the past that positively impacted local sentiment, such as support to hospitals, schools, recognizing local employees. And really the benefit of this is that it ultimately drove ongoing monitoring efforts, as well as better informed the organization as to what actions they could take to mitigate attacks, as well as how they could positively influence local sentiment.
How can you use the threat landscape to then influence your cyber threat modeling?
I mean, the short answer is, the more you know about your own vulnerabilities and your risks, the better you can defend yourself. For example, if neighboring adversarial nations are routinely targeting either your industry or multinational organizations in general, I mean, if you, knowing how they operate or what their TTPs are, indicators of compromise, I mean, all of that allows you to harden your systems to better detect, but it also comes down to education. So, I mean, if you have to educate your people on, are these attacks, is this happening because somebody is sending phishing links, via email, text, direct message, and also educating them on any social engineering tactics that may be employed by the local populace. All of this comes together and just really helps you better defend yourself going forward.
All right, excellent, thank you. So that was really some good insight. Panelists, thank you very much on 3 different use cases. So we are getting near to the end of our presentation. We wanted to leave you with some key takeaways. So our first recommendation is to be curious. And what we mean by that is get to know your organization, understand the assets, understand your executives, know what is important to them, and then take those use cases and develop priority intelligence requirements or use cases that can then allow you to go and get the tools that you need. Once you have your vendors in, make sure that you know the capabilities of those tools or those services and what they're able to support you with. And then remember to provide them feedback because they can't make their products or services better if you don't let them know what exactly that you need. Remember that intelligence provides decision advantage. We talked about that quite a bit. I'm hoping that you now are going to be able to feel like you can go to your executives and start giving them more briefings, more reports, give them that so what factor, make them understand how intelligence can help make them more informed about decisions they have to make. And finally, remember that information sharing is your secret weapon. So the more that you share, the more that we're working to defend against the actors. Figure out what ISAC or ISAO that you might belong to in your sector, and also develop relationships with your local law enforcement, such as the FBI, DHS, CISA, Secret Service, or Homeland Security Investigations. So there's a lot of different groups that can help you. They have a lot of information if you have an incident you're responding to, and they also like to know what's going on in the various sectors because it adds to other cases are working. So finally, we wanted to leave you with some resources and tools. So we provided a link here for the National Council of ISACs, as well as the Information Sharing Analysis Organizations. Also the legal considerations that Tom talked about around collecting intelligence and what are you supposed to do to be able to legally do some of this work. And then DHS CISA has a catalog of exploited vulnerabilities. If you don't know about that, they update that very regularly. You can get on distribution for that. If you're a newcomer to Intel, highly recommend you check out Katie Nichols' reference library. She has a self-study plan, and also she's speaking here several times this week. And then finally, we have the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which if you don't know about that, it is a library of tactics and techniques the actors are using, really influential in developing your threat modeling program and helping you enhance the rules in your SIM or other security tools that to make sure you have coverage for the various TTPs. All right, with that, that wraps it up for us. I think now we can turn it over we have some time left for Q&A. And we have a microphone here. Goodness. All right, here, sir.
Hi, Stephen Faulkner. What advice would you give to customers when selecting threat intelligence platforms or partners? What would be the key advisory points?
Do you want answer that?
Go ahead. I couldn't hear him.
He said, what advice would you give when selecting an intelligence platform?
Okay.
Platforms or partners, yeah.
Or
Or
partners.
partners.
So I would look at your environment and your use cases, what it is that you're trying to solve, and then figure out which vendors can then best support that, and then actually do bake-offs. So bring them in, talk to them, see if they can manage your requirements, and then if they have a product, do a proof of value to make sure that they can meet your needs. Don't just bring somebody in based off paper, but definitely understand what you are trying to get out of it first.
Sure. Thank you.
Hello, Chaz Scott, Incident Response Team Lead at NGA. So I work in the intelligence community. Levi, we actually use some of your products, but nonetheless, you mentioned the so what now. What do you recommend as it relates to helping analysts kind of train up their critical thinking skills to help us make better decisions using the platforms, you know, from cyber threat intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are resources out there to better understand some of the science behind second order thinking, but that's really what we're talking about, is analysts being able to increase their skills in second order thinking and second order implications, which is, for example, if China is embedding themselves in India's power grid, which we've seen over the last 2 years, right? A Western CISO or even a CEO of an enterprise may look at that and say, why do I care that China has embedded themselves in the Indian power grid, right, with different implants? Why do I care about that, right? It's the analyst's job to go, okay, the second order implication here for a Western business is, do we outsource IT functions to India? Do we outsource call centers to India? Do we have other types of business partners in India? Have we done a tabletop exercise to understand their reliance on the grid in India? Do they have backup generators? Have we started to diversify some of our geopolitical risk outside of India, right? Are we prepared for the scenario where our tier one partners in India are down because there's no power, right? As a kinetic escalation may happen between China and India, we can see that happening. So the second order implication is, are we asking the questions and are we prepared for what we see developing on the other side of the world that's going to have real material implications for us as an organization? So again, it comes back to second order implications, and this is something that, again, there are good online resources, but I find that analysts tend to have a native ability to do this or not, and some analysts are very good at it. And I think if you have a broad background in geopolitical, some business, and cyber, and you sort of think about it like a Venn diagram, those overlapping subject areas, if you have a little bit of understanding in those three foundational areas, you set yourself up as an analyst to do well at those second order implications. And that's really what executive teams want from their intelligence analysts. They don't want a rehash of events they already know about, and increasing awareness doesn't really help them, right? To the point that Lisa made, if you're going to get to a decision advantage, you have to be able to execute on what the second order implications are of a particular event or series of events.
And I would add that the analysts really need to do their homework on their organization. You might think you know your organization, but you don't really. Go attend lots of sessions when executives are talking. Understand what's important to them. Make sure that, you know, if you're rolling out a new product, know about that product. Look for in the deep and dark web for actors talking about it. Different things like that. I mean, Russia-Ukraine was a really good example. Most of us didn't have a clue why we cared about what was happening other than the human factor, right? Some organizations had people in Russia or people in Ukraine or even the surrounding countries, and how are you going to protect them? So there's lots of different ways, like the second order factor. What is the cause and effect? If you can just demonstrate that so what to the leaders, they'll better get it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, I have two questions. First one is, from a Intel vendor perspective, have you seen federal law enforcement agencies become more consumers rather than producers for the intelligence gathered that's distributed to organizations? And then the second question is, you mentioned deepfakes. Do you have any preventative or mitigative recommendations you can kind of, I guess, suggest here to the audience as far as how we would stop or identify that kind of activity?
Yep.
Oh, I was just going to share very quickly your first part of your question. Spot on. We're seeing more and more because if you use a commercial vendor and we're doing this work for commercial purposes, this data becomes commercially available. So it becomes publicly available that if you're a law enforcement or a government agency, it actually makes it a lot easier to use this information. And then they can apply that and overlay it with their different classified sources. And we're seeing that there's a greater appreciation for the open source capabilities and how it can really transform even the way the government is understanding threats in this world.
Yeah, I would say as both a consumer and also as a partner, as they're becoming more aware of, like our open source capabilities, just being able to reach out to a vendor and share what information they can in order to, solve the problem a lot quicker, whether it's finding a person, but yeah, I would say it's consumer and partnership.
But just to piggyback on what they said, within federal law enforcement particularly, there's been a nice shift from, when I was in law enforcement, it was, we only got credit for the work if somebody was in handcuffs and we were able to prosecute them, right? And in cyber, that takes years sometimes. So it was really frustrating. And I think federal law enforcement has changed the criteria for success to now one of their more material statistics they measure on is how many victims are they notifying. Yeah. And that's great because now they get credit for work they're doing to help the private sector and help that, that side of businesses, where before it was like, agents didn't really have an interest in it because it really wasn't part of success. So I'm seeing that as a huge shift where a lot of agents are just focused on how do we proactively notify victims who maybe we know that, we see Cobalt Strike in their environment, but the ransomware payload hasn't been pushed yet, right? And they're actually able to intervene, and that's really exciting, I think.
And it really emphasizes the public-private partnership there. Okay, sir?
Hi, my name is Dennis. One of the problem or challenge we have is the operationalizing the whole threat intel life cycle. So we're pretty good with taking those proactive indicators, the what part of the threat intel, TTPs, IOCs, blocking them, but we all know the key element of that is the human intelligence. So what recommendation you have is to take all these scattered data, trying to connect those pieces and uncovering the who's and the human element behind these intelligence.
Yeah, just one thing recommendation is broaden kind of your use cases beyond just the blocking and tackling at the network perimeter. Mm-hmm. We have absolutely seen when it comes to fraud loss prevention, one of the easiest ways to justify spend here, and because you can save millions of dollars on a weekly basis if you are looking at the right places, understanding how these different environments are operating. And that's one where you start to broaden that use case beyond just the network defense. And it's the same Intel process, it's the same vendors. They can actually support a lot of different use cases, and sometimes that makes it a little bit easier to really justify the spend that you're looking for.
I think threat modeling is another thing I would add. If you can get threat modeling from an actor perspective to understand what actors might come after your organization, then you look at the various TTPs from those actors and make sure you have coverage in your SIM. You can do threat hunting packages. There's a lot of different other areas that you can spread intel into. I think if you can do some of that, that might help as well. You go over here, sir.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Tom mentioned that there's no one organization has a full piece of puzzles. So I was wondering about the overlap between threat intel or platforms. And you recommend organization to have multiple source of threat intel, or one platform is enough?
So I'll start with that. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think you have different needs for different vendors based on the use cases in your organization. You'll hear a theme here, right? Understand what is important to you and what you're trying to protect. And then you can look at the various vendors that provide those kind of services and look at them. Some organizations will need 2, 3, maybe 4 different providers depending on your organization and also the needs of what you're trying to satisfy there.
Yeah, this is, hi, it's a wonderful session. In relation to the same query, like we have multiple industries, right? Banking, health, and all those stuff. Now, when you are trying to put across threat intelligence to one platform or one agency, right? Naturally, you will not have the perspective from that particular industry. For example, I'm from the banking industry. where the threat intel is required for me as a consumer. I need to know from a fraud standpoint as well as from cyber attack standpoint, right? So both need to be there, right? And where intelligence is always on specific areas, right, in government or whatever aspects. But why our industry doesn't actually offer that? It's more of, catering to all the all the industries in one shot, typically TTPs, attacks, and we also face a lot of issues in terms of misinformation, more of an attack information rather than how the attack happened. So that's one aspect of threat intel which we have a challenge. The second is more on threat predictions. How do you be able to, not a post facto, but as a pre facto, how do you predict the threats and help us get that as an intelligence and make actionable activities?
Predictive intelligence is a hard problem. I'm not really sure that we can actually answer that question. Because it's something that we want to get to, and I think AI is going to help us with that. But I think we're far from that. Like AI is going to augment what we do as a human to help us understand and be able to predict what actions may come from an event. And sometimes you might be the first person that sees it. Sometimes you may be 10th person that sees it. The more that you can share information across organizations and sectors, not just within a sector, the better defensive options that you're going to be able to have, I think. Anything to add?
A lot of it comes back again to second order thinking, right? So if you want predictive analysis, if you want analysts to prognosticate about what's coming, it's that fundamental science of second order implications. And we see events and data points, and here's what we think the implication of that is, putting all the context around it. And your analysts also have to be free to be wrong, right? Because if you ask them to prognosticate and to try to predict more, then there has to be the space that they may be wrong, and that's okay, right? As long as it's based on good data points and good fundamental analysis, that's really important.
Just one more point, if I may ask you. I mean, since the topic is on the ROI, what would be one of those two KRI which I can actually present it to my board, that I have these vendors and who's actually helping me in actually preventing my attacks?
Yeah, again, it's going to depend on your organization, but if you can tie the intelligence that you're sharing with your SOC, with your vulnerability management team, with your various teams to show where intelligence is providing value into that, then it's a hard thing to do. It's not easy, but that is the best way that I've seen to show the value of intelligence.
But it's actually not return on investment, it's return on security investment.
Right.
And there's actually some academic papers that have been written on the difference between ROI and ROSI. And there's formulas behind it, but ROI is, as a business, right, how are we juicing revenue, right? Whereas ROSI is how are we reducing risk, and how do we want to calculate that and talk about how we calculate that. And they're two very different things. So a little bit of it is just education, especially at the executive level on, well, let's agree first on how we talk about risk reduction and quantifying that. And to Lisa's point, that's not easy or straightforward, but it is definitely achievable.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And because you have a kilt on, sir, you get to do it.
Well, I guess the kilt guy gets it.
That's right.
All right, so thank you for this and wonderful talk. With the government's practice of going with super small businesses for large scale contracts and these sorts of things, clearly I work in the defense industry business. How do you socialize the need for a small to medium-sized company to actually invest in not just one? Because I agree, you have to have more than one threat intel based on your threat landscape, right? So how do you socialize that to your board, which is going to be supremely reluctant to do that? I mean, the ROSI is a good place to start, but how do you recommend having those conversations?
So I would almost go back to the bake-off scenario that we covered in the beginning, because if you're able to conduct a bake-off and you're able to show how these different solutions provide different information that complements each other, and that only having one of the two, you're only going to have like a piece of the puzzle, I think that can help, at least like showing, the value that you've gotten out of two. That would at least be one recommendation. I mean, at the end of the day, we all have, a limited budget. And so you're going to have to go with the solution that provides the most value for your use case. But I think that could help, just showing that like there isn't a one size fits all. And I mean, frequently you need more than one.
Yeah, so basically back to the Venn diagram.
In a way, yes, but if you can start showing that impact analysis and showing how having this vendor, you know, allowed you to stop this threat or allowed you to harden this defense, and if you can create metrics that can show that, then that's really how you're demonstrating to them that you are getting value out of what you've asked for. It's just not easy to do.
No, it isn't. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, thank you all. Really appreciate you guys sticking around and listening to the Q&A, and let us know if you have any questions.